Okay. Here's another big one. Iraq. And let's take a trip in the Wayback Machine, if we can, and mention that this area, modern day Iraq, is ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River, the cradle of civilization. Was this the first civilization on Earth 5,000 plus years ago? Some would say yes. Others say Egypt, but this might be number two. This is an incredibly important historic land. It was the crossroads between trade with the East, the old Silk Road, and trade with the West. It was part of great Persian empires historically. And the city of Baghdad, capital of Iraq, was the center of the Islamic Empire when it was at its greatest, 750 AD to about 1250, 500 years, when the Islamic Empire was one of the world's great civilizations. So yeah, this is an incredibly important historic place. And we know that after World War I, the British and the French split up the Middle East, kind of arbitrarily drew lines around countries. The British took Iraq, the biggest of these areas, and some would suggest they did a really, really bad job when they were drawing the lines. Oh, the post-World War I decisions, how bad they were. One thing that the British did was they ignored that there was really three distinctly different groups in Iraq. There are the Kurds, who think they should have their own country in this northern area they call Kurdistan. Historically, they speak a different language. They're not Arabs. They're very different culturally than the Arabs, who really make up the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, even parts of North Africa. In the eastern part of Iraq, there's a group called Shiite Muslims, who are very different and have been kind of not working with, but maybe working against Sunni Muslims who are located more down in this area, in the southwest. So this area was not well thought out when it was created, this country, and it was under British control. We know that around the year 1910, oil was discovered in Iran, which was then oil pumping facilities, were oil drilling facilities, were created by the Brits. And they started extracting Iranian oil and getting it for pennies on the dollar. Oil was also discovered in Saudi Arabia. So the Brits, with American help also, decided, let's look for some oil in Iraq. And in the 1920s, oil is discovered in Iraq. Oil is going to play a really large part in the destiny of these Middle Eastern countries all the way through the 1900s into today. It should come as no surprise that the car became big in the 1920s and 30s. And the car runs on oil. Also planes run on oil. Oil is the key natural resource, fossil fuel of the 1900s. I've said before, coal was the 1800s and oil is the 1900s. So here we have Iraq. And after World War II, Iraq is going to work towards its independence from Britain. In the 70s, Iraq's going to work towards nationalizing its oil and taking more control of it. And then in 1979, of course, Iran has a revolution, and the great friend to the Americans and the Brits, who had been giving America and the British, mostly the British, cheap oil, was now separate and took American embassy and he took hostages and held them for hundreds of days. They were kind of enemy. Certainly not a friend anymore. And at this point, Iraq gets a leader named Saddam Hussein. He's a militaristic guy. And in 1980, he starts a war with Iran. This war was religious. He was a Sunni Muslim. Iran is mostly Shiite Muslim. And although Iran is Persia, historically, they speak a different language. They're different culturally than the Middle Eastern countries. There was always kind of some connection there in the eastern part of Iraq, right along this border region with Iraq and Iran. And now they're fighting. And we know Sunnis and Shiites, they've had disagreements for 1,000+ years since the very beginning of Islam. But really, this fight was mostly about control over the Straits of Hormuz. This little waterway right here. They both wanted control over it. And they will fight a war. Now, the book doesn't come right out and say this, but the U.S. helped facilitate. Remember how this goes. Facilitate weapons trading between the Iraqis and themselves. Now, that means the U.S. doesn't come straight out and say, hey, here's some weapons, Iraq. But the U.S. is going to use a middleman, a third party, who remains nameless. I don't know who these people are, who allows Iraq to get U.S. weapons. Bottom line. And the U.S., of course, was following an old theory. It goes like this. It's a World War II thing. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Right? If you think back to Stalin, the U.S. did not like communism. They were not happy about communist Russia, but they worked together to defeat Hitler because Hitler was the enemy. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The U.S. and Iran are now having problems. And Iraq wants to fight Iran, so Iraq must be my friend. This theory will be tested in this period, not just in Iraq. Well, he at first maybe was losing, and then Iraq starts to win, and Saddam Hussein starts using chemical weapons on the people of Iran. Now, what are chemical weapons? These are things like VX nerve gas, mustard gas. Think World War I in the trenches, the gas masks, right? You breathe it could kill you. And they're using these weapons. All these red spots on this map are areas where they actually used chemical weapons against Iran. And you can see that Iran had gotten into Iraq. So they're kind of defending their own land here, and up here they're going to move a little bit into Iran. And the U.S., I'm not sure if these are part of the weapons that were facilitated to be traded. But then after he starts to win, and this war drags on, almost 10 years, he starts to use chemical weapons against the Kurds in the north. Now, remember, the Kurds were kind of separate and wanted to stay separate from the Arabs in the south, in the central and southern areas of Iraq. And the U.S. says, you can't do that. No, you can't kill your own people with chemical weapons. That's not okay. And now, Saddam Hussein says, whatever, this is my country, you can mind your own. And now the US in the mid-80s says, we got to slow this guy down. Let's facilitate weapons trade with Iran. And then they were going to use some of this money to fund groups in Nicaragua. We'll get to Latin America. This was called the Iran Contra scandal. It was proven, it bore out in investigations that the U.S. did in fact sell weapons to Iran, or facilitate weapon sales to Iran. So the U.S. is now selling weapons to both. Size of this war? Can I get a USA? Okay. And now the US has problems with both these countries. In 1990, Iraq attacked and invaded a small country that had a lot of oil, remember oil, called Kuwait. The US gets together with the UN and says, Iraq, you need to get out or else we're going to go to war with you. Now, the US had really stayed out of real wars since Vietnam, since their loss in Vietnam. So this is the first war I can remember in my life. I was a sophomore in high school. And the US led an international force and attacked Iraq to get them out of Kuwait. Mostly they did airstrikes. I remember this scene right here. This was actually Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. Every night I would turn on the TV. The war lasted like a week, okay? You would see, the skies lit up over Baghdad, and U.S. planes would be flying over top, dropping bombs, and then there would be all this anti-aircraft fire. It was like fireworks. It was like Star Wars. It was crazy. I remember. I was like, what the heck? And the U.S. ends up winning this war. The U.S. had also hoped that they could weaken and topple Saddam Hussein, get him out of power. And as he's driving out of Kuwait, infamously, famous in a bad way, the U.S. President George Bush I decides he's going to bomb the caravan of vehicles leaving Kuwait. Usually you don't bomb someone when they're running away. And this made the U.S. look really bad. After a few out, after like a day or something, they stopped doing that, but they knocked out a lot of his weapons. Also, in this war, it's the last time I can remember a line of tanks that lined up against the U.S. So after a few days of air bombing, the U.S. tanks rolled in, and they had their tanks lined up, but they were old Russian tanks, and our tanks could fire further. So we knocked them out, and their bombs couldn't hit us. And then they left, they just ran. And as the US rolled in, they found a bunch of empty tanks, they would destroy them. Last tank war I remember. And after the war, the US put harsh economic sanctions on Iraq, which hurt them economically with money. They also created no-fly zones where the Iraqis couldn't fly. But they allowed the Iraqis to fly helicopters, so they couldn't fly planes, but they could fly helicopters over certain portions of Iraq, and this allowed them to attack the Kurds in the north, who had helped us, who we had said, if you guys take out Saddam Hussein, we'll try and help you guys, we'll be partners. But we allowed him to attack them, which creates distrust there. The poor Kurds, they help us, and then we hurt them over and over again in the last 30 years. Also during this period, the US created some military bases in Saudi Arabia, who's an ally, is a friend. We buy a lot of oil from them. Oil, right? So we could fly our planes and then turn around and come back. Before that, we were doing it in Italy, and that's a further fly. And the US wins. Kuwait, Saddam's out of Kuwait. He's hurt economically now. I thought I heard once that he had like the 5th largest military in the world. He had a pretty big military before this war. And hooray, I guess. But we're not done in Iraq. And we'll talk about that in the second half of this lecture.